There's nothing more heartbreaking than watching your child struggle to breathe while you count pennies for medicine. Mateo Cruz knew this pain every single day as he sold trinkets on Manila's streets, his son's wheezing echoing in his mind. A small barefoot girl walked up to him and said, "Please, sir, follow me." He followed her to an old mansion where she showed him ancient murals that glowed in moonlight. The girl named Lucia said her father left treasure for a kind man. What seemed like helping a lost child became a treasure hunt worth 9 billion pesos. But dangerous people wanted the treasure too. Mateo had to protect Lucia and choose between keeping the money for his family or using it to help his city. Who was this mysterious girl, and why did she pick him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through the thin walls of their cramped apartment at 4:30 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 3 years. Mateo Cruz rolled over on the worn mattress, his back protesting against the springs that had given up their fight long ago. In the dim light filtering through the single window, he could see his son Miguel's small chest rising and falling with that familiar wheeze that never quite left him, even in sleep. Mateo reached for the vintage photograph on the makeshift nightstand, a piece of cardboard, balanced on 2 stacked books. The edges of the photo were worn smooth from his nightly ritual of holding it before sleep. There they were, him, his beloved wife Carmen, and 2-year-old Miguel, all smiles at Rizal Park on a Sunday afternoon that felt like a lifetime ago. Carmen's laugh seemed to echo from the faded image, her eyes bright with the dreams they'd shared. Dreams of Miguel going to good schools, of family vacations, of a future that sparkled with possibility. Now, Carmen's absence filled the small space like a weight that pressed down on everything. The asthma medication bottles lined up on the windowsill served as a constant reminder that some battles couldn't be won with love alone. They required money, and money was something that slipped through Mateo's fingers like water through a broken dam. "Papa!" Miguel's voice was barely a whisper, rough from the night's struggle with his breathing. "I'm here, Mijo." Mateo slipped the photograph back into his shirt pocket, where it lived against his heart. "How are you feeling this morning?" Miguel sat up slowly, his thin frame lost in the oversized t-shirt that had once belonged to his father. "Better, I think. The new medicine helped." The new medicine. Mateo's stomach clenched as he remembered the pharmacist's patient but firm voice yesterday. "Mr. Cruz, I'm sorry, but we can't extend any more credit. The account is already past due." He'd had to choose between Miguel's inhaler and dinner, and the choice had been simple, even if it meant his own stomach would growl through the night. "That's good, son. Very good." Mateo ruffled Miguel's dark hair, so much like Carmen's had been. "Are you ready for another adventure today?" It was their morning game, born from necessity but nurtured by love. Every day became an adventure when you had to make magic from nothing, when a father's creativity was the only currency that mattered. Miguel's eyes brightened despite his fatigue, and Mateo felt that familiar surge of purpose that had carried him through the darkest days since Carmen's death. The morning routine unfolded like a well-choreographed dance. Mateo prepared Miguel's nebulizer treatment while his son got dressed, the machine's gentle hum filling their small space with the promise of easier breathing. They had 15 minutes while the medication worked its way into Miguel's lungs, 15 minutes for Mateo to transform their meager breakfast into something special. "Today, we're having explorer's porridge," Mateo announced, stirring a small pot of rice porridge on their single burner. "This is what the great Filipino heroes ate before they discovered new lands." Miguel giggled, the sound slightly raspy but genuine. "What did they discover, Papa?" "They discovered that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you are afraid." Mateo spooned the simple porridge into their only matching bowls, adding a sprinkle of brown sugar they'd saved from a coffee shop packet, and they discovered that family is the greatest treasure of all. The words carried more weight than usual this morning, though Mateo couldn't quite say why. Perhaps it was the dream he'd had, filled with ancient maps and whispered secrets. Or maybe it was the way the sunlight seemed to dance differently through their window, as if the day held something unexpected. Mrs. Santos's gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Their elderly neighbor had become like a grandmother to Miguel, stepping in with the kind of quiet support that asked for nothing in return. She owned a small sari-sari store on the ground floor of their building, and her presence in their lives had been a blessing Mateo thanked God for every day. "Good morning, Santos family," she called through the door, using the term of endearment that always made Miguel beam with pride. "Good morning, Lola Santos," Miguel called back, using the respectful term for grandmother as Mateo opened the door. The small woman entered with her usual quiet dignity, carrying a paper bag that smelled of fresh pan diesel. "I thought you might enjoy some bread with your breakfast. My supplier brought extra this morning." Mateo's throat tightened with gratitude. Mrs. Santos always had extra on the days when money was tightest, her generosity disguised as casual coincidence. "You're too kind to us." "Nonsense. We're neighbors. This is what neighbors do." She settled into the plastic chair that served as their guest seating, her eyes automatically checking Miguel's color and breathing. "How is our young scholar today?" "I'm good, Lola. Papa says we're going to the market later, and I can help him count the money." Miguel's pride in his contribution was evident, unaware that his simple presence made even the hardest days bearable for his father. Mrs. Santos nodded approvingly. "Learning about business is important. Your papa is teaching you well." After she left, Mateo helped Miguel with his morning exercises, gentle stretches, and breathing techniques that Dr. Reyes had taught them during one of their rare visits to the clinic. The doctor had been another unexpected angel in their lives, reducing his fees and sometimes waiving them entirely, understanding that Mateo's love for his son was payment enough for a man with a generous heart. "Papa, why do some people have so much money and others have so little?" Miguel asked, as they prepared to leave for the day. It was the kind of question that could break a father's heart or strengthen his resolve. Mateo chose strength. "That's a very good question, mijo. Sometimes life isn't fair, but that doesn't mean we give up. We work hard, we treat people with kindness, and we remember that money isn't the only kind of wealth. What other kinds are there?" Mateo knelt down to Miguel's level, looking into eyes that held his wife's wisdom and his own determination. "There's the wealth of a good heart, the wealth of knowledge, the wealth of friends who care about you. And there's the wealth of knowing that no matter what happens, your family loves you completely." Miguel nodded solemnly, processing this information with the seriousness of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. "I think we're very wealthy then." "Yes, son, we are." They gathered their supplies for the dyer, small folding table, a cloth to display their wares, and a plastic container filled with the small items Mateo had collected through the week. Keychains, small toys, phone accessories, anything that might appeal to the foot traffic around the post office, where he'd claimed his small corner of the sidewalk. The walk to their spot took them through the heart of old Manila, past buildings that had witnessed centuries of history. Mateo made it a point to share stories with Miguel as they walked, turning their commute into a moving classroom. "See that building, Mijo? That's where important letters used to be sorted and sent all over the world. People would wait weeks to hear from their families in other countries." Miguel looked up at the imposing structure with new respect. "Is that why you chose to sell things there?" "Partly, but also because it's where people come when they have hope that their packages will arrive, hope that their messages will reach the people they love. I think hope is good for business." They set up their small display with practiced efficiency, Mateo arranging the items, while Miguel helped organize the small bills and coins in their money box. The morning sun climbed higher, bringing with it the familiar sounds of Manila, awakening jeepneys honking, vendors calling out their wares, the distant sound of church bells marking the passage of time. The first customers were always the early commuters, people rushing to work who might need a phone charger or a small gift for someone they'd forgotten. Mateo had learned to read the city's rhythms, to anticipate what people might need before they knew they needed it. "Good morning, sir." Miguel would call out cheerfully to potential customers, his innocent enthusiasm often succeeding where adult sales tactics failed. "My papa has the best keychains in Manila." By mid-morning, they had earned enough for Miguel's lunch and a small portion of what they'd need for his evening medication. It was progress, measured in small victories that added up to survival. That's when Mateo noticed the girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, standing barefoot near the post office steps, watching them with an intensity that seemed unusual for a child. Her clothes were clean but simple, her dark hair pulled back in a neat braid. There was something in her eyes, a depth that spoke of experiences beyond her years. For a moment, their gazes met across the busy sidewalk. She smiled, an expression that was both shy and knowing, before disappearing into the crowd of pedestrians. "Papa, who was that girl?" Miguel asked, having followed his father's gaze. "I'm not sure, son. Probably just someone passing by." But even as he said it, Mateo felt an odd certainty that this wasn't the last time they would see her. There had been something about her presence, something that made the ordinary morning feel touched by mystery. The day wore on, with its usual mixture of small sales and long waits. Miguel helped when he could, his energy flagging as the afternoon heat intensified. Mateo made sure his son stayed in the shade, monitoring his breathing and offering water regularly. As evening approached and they prepared to pack up their remaining items, Mateo counted the day's earnings. It was enough for Miguel's medicine, but just barely. Tomorrow would bring the same challenge, the same careful balance between hope and desperation. "Papa, do you think Mama can see us?" Miguel asked quietly as they folded their table. The question caught Mateo off guard, hitting him with the force of pure love and loss combined. "I think she can, mijo, and I think she's very proud of how brave and kind you are. I miss her. I miss her too, son. Every day." They walked home in comfortable silence, the weight of the day's work mixing with the deeper weight of memories and dreams deferred. But as they turned the corner toward their building, Mateo caught sight of the barefoot girl again, this time standing near the entrance to their apartment complex. She was waiting for them, he realized. Waiting with the patience of someone who had something important to say. As they approached, she stepped forward, her small hand reaching out to tug gently at Mateo's sleeve. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but her words would echo in his memory for years to come. "Please, sir, follow me." The worn photograph in Mateo's pocket seemed to pulse against his chest, as if Carmen herself was whispering that some adventures were worth the risk, that sometimes the greatest treasures came disguised as the smallest voices asking for trust. Mateo's first instinct was to look around for the girl's parents, but the evening crowd moved past them like water around stones, each person absorbed in their own urgent destination. The child stood patiently, her small hand still touching his sleeve, her dark eyes holding a certainty that seemed to belong to someone much older. "Are you lost, little one?" Mateo asked gently, crouching down to her level. Miguel moved closer, his natural curiosity overcoming any shyness. "No, sir. I've been waiting for you." Her voice carried a slight accent, something refined that spoke of education and careful upbringing. "My name is Lucia, and I need to show you something very important." Miguel tugged on his father's shirt. "Papa, maybe her mama is looking for her." Lucia shook her head with the gravity of a child who had been entrusted with serious business. "I don't have a mama anymore, but I have something that belongs to you." The words sent a chill through Mateo. There was something in her manner, something in the way she stood with perfect posture, despite her bare feet, that suggested this was no ordinary lost child. Yet every instinct he possessed as a father told him to help her. "What do you mean it belongs to me? We've never met before." "Haven't we?" Lucia tilted her head, studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You're the man who gives away his last peso to help others. You're the man who tells his son stories to make him forget his troubles. You're the man who carries a picture of his wife next to his heart." Mateo's hand moved instinctively to his shirt pocket, where Carmen's photograph rested. How could this child know these things? "Please, sir, Follow me. I promise you'll be safe, and I promise this will help your son." Miguel's breathing had grown slightly labored from the excitement and the day's exertion. Mateo needed to get him home for his evening treatment, but something in Lucia's eyes held him. It was the look of someone who had been carrying a heavy burden and finally found the right person to share it with. "Where do you want to take us?" "Not far. Just through the old streets, to a place that's been waiting for someone like you." Against his better judgment, against every practical thought screaming in his head, Mateo found himself nodding. "Miguel, stay close to me." Lucia led them away from the main road, through narrow alleys that twisted between buildings like veins through an old man's hand. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows that danced across weathered walls covered in decades of paint and memory. This was old Manila, the part that tourists rarely saw, where history lived in the cracks between stones and the whispered stories of grandmothers. The girl moved with purpose, her bare feet silent on the uneven pavement. She navigated the maze of passages as if she had walked this route 1,000 times, pausing occasionally to ensure they were following, but never showing uncertainty about the direction. "Papa, where is she taking us?" Miguel whispered, his hand finding his father's. "I don't know, son, but sometimes in life we have to trust that good things can happen, even when we don't understand them." After 10 minutes of walking, they emerged into a small courtyard dominated by a 3-story mansion that seemed to exist outside of time. The Spanish colonial architecture spoke of an era when Manila was the western terminus of the galleon trade, when this neighborhood housed merchants and officials who shaped the destiny of empires. Thick vines covered much of the facade, and several windows were boarded shut, but the bones of the building remained proud and strong. "This is where I live," Lucia said simply, as if grand mansions were the natural habitat of barefoot children. She produced a brass key from somewhere in her simple dress, an ornate piece that looked like it had been crafted by artisans who understood that even functional objects could be works of art. The key turned smoothly in the heavy wooden door, which opened with a groan that seemed to echo from centuries past. The interior took Mateo's breath away. Despite the building's neglected exterior, the main hall gleamed with polished wood and carefully maintained tile work. A grand staircase curved upward toward the second floor, its banister carved with intricate patterns that caught and reflected the late afternoon light, streaming through tall windows. "How do you live here alone?" Mateo asked, his voice echoing in the spacious room. "I'm not alone. My grandmother takes care of me, but she's visiting family in the provinces. She'll be back soon." Lucia moved through the space with the confidence of someone thoroughly at home. "But that's not why I brought you here. Come, I want to show you something special." She led them up the staircase, past portraits of stern-faced men and elegant women who seemed to watch their progress with approval. The second-floor hallway stretched toward the back of the house, lined with doors that suggested rooms full of memories and secrets. "In here," Lucia said, opening a door at the end of the hall. The room beyond was unlike anything Mateo had ever seen. The walls were covered with an enormous mural that depicted Manila Bay as it might have looked centuries ago, complete with galleons sailing toward a setting sun. But as they watched, something extraordinary happened. The late afternoon light, filtered through a skylight above, began to transform the painting. What had appeared to be simple decorative elements started to move and shift, creating the illusion of waves lapping against the shore and clouds drifting across a painted sky. More remarkably, symbols began to appear throughout the mural, stars, numbers, and geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Miguel gasped in wonder, his breathing problems momentarily forgotten in the face of such magic. "Papa, how is it doing that?" "I don't know, Maijo. I've never seen anything like it." Lucia moved to stand before the mural, her small figure dwarfed by the magnificent display. "My papa painted this before he died. He was very clever. He used special paints that react to light and shadow. But more than that, he hid messages in the pictures." "What kind of messages?" "Messages about treasure, Mr. Cruz. Real treasure that he left for someone special, someone who would use it to help people instead of keeping it all for themselves. The brass key seemed to grow warm in Lucia's hand as she spoke. She held it up, and in the shifting light of the mural, they could see that it bore the same symbols that were now dancing across the walls. My papa was very rich, but he was also very sad about how many people in Manila didn't have enough food or medicine or safe places to live. Before he died, he hid his treasure and made a map to find it. But he said it could only be found by someone with a good heart. Mateo felt the familiar weight of his wife's photograph against his chest. The practical part of his mind insisted this was elaborate fantasy, a child's game born from grief and imagination. But another part of him, the part that still believed in miracles despite all evidence to the contrary, recognized something profound happening in this magical room. "Why did you choose me, Lucia?" "Because I've been watching you, Mr. Cruz. For weeks, I've seen how you treat people, how you take care of your son, how you share what little you have with others. My papa said the right person would reveal themselves through their actions, not their words." She moved to a specific section of the mural where a lighthouse stood sentinel over the bay. As she touched the painted structure with her key, a hidden panel slid away, revealing a small compartment containing what appeared to be a folded piece of parchment. "This is the first clue," she said, offering the paper to Mateo. "But I must warn you, there are others who know about my papa's treasure. Bad people who would use it for selfish things. If you decide to help me find it, there will be danger." Miguel stepped closer to his father, his young mind processing the impossibility and wonder of what they were witnessing. "Papa, is this real?" Mateo unfolded the parchment, revealing elegant handwriting in both Spanish and English. The clue was written in the form of a riddle. "Where the first stones were blessed, and the faithful still gather, seek the sign of the cross where angels keep watch." His mind immediately went to the oldest churches in Manila, particularly San Agustin in Intramuros. But even as he worked through the puzzle, a deeper question nagged at him. Was he really considering this? Was he prepared to chase after what might be an elaborate delusion, potentially putting Miguel at risk? "I need to think about this," he said finally. "This is a lot to understand." Lucia nodded with the patience of someone who had expected such a response. "Of course, but please don't take too long, Mr. Cruz. The bad people are getting closer, and if they find the treasure first, they'll use it to hurt many people instead of helping them." As they prepared to leave the mansion, Mateo couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn toward something larger than himself. The brass key glinted in Lucia's small hand, and the mural seemed to whisper promises of adventure and purpose. Walking home through the darkening streets, Miguel's excitement was palpable despite his fatigue. "Papa, do you think it's real? Do you think there's really treasure?" Mateo looked down at his son, seeing Carmen's hope reflected in the boy's eyes. "I think, Mijo, that sometimes the most important treasures aren't gold or money. Sometimes they're the adventures we take and the people we help along the way." But even as he spoke the words, Mateo felt the weight of possibility settling around him like a cloak. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to follow a child's promise into the unknown, or continue the familiar struggle of their daily existence. The choice, he realized, would define not just his future, but the kind of man he wanted his son to remember him being. That night, Mateo lay awake listening to Miguel's breathing, the riddle turning over and over in his mind like a prayer wheel. The rational part of him insisted he was entertaining the fantasies of a grieving child, but the photograph in his pocket seemed to pulse with Carmen's memory, reminding him of all the dreams they'd shared about giving Miguel a better life. When morning came, he had made his decision. "Miguel, how would you like to visit some of the old churches today? Learn a little about our history?" His son's eyes lit up with excitement that made the wheeze in his chest seem lighter. "The ones with the treasure clues?" "Perhaps. But remember, the real treasure is what we learn together." They prepared for the day with extra care, packing Miguel's inhaler, a water bottle, and some of Mrs. Santos's leftover pan de sal. As they set out for Intramuros, the old walled city that had been the heart of Spanish colonial power, Mateo felt a mixture of anticipation and protective concern that any father would recognize. The jeepney ride to Intramuros gave them time to talk about the history they were about to encounter. Mateo pointed out landmarks through the small windows, weaving stories that made the city come alive for his son. You see, Mijo, this whole area used to be surrounded by thick walls to protect it from pirates and invaders. The Spanish built their most important buildings here: the government palace, the cathedral, and the oldest stone church in the Philippines. San Agustin Church? Exactly. It's been standing for over 400 years, through earthquakes, wars, and typhoons. Think about all the people who have prayed there, all the hope that those old stones have witnessed. San Agustin Church rose before them like a testament to endurance, its Baroque facade weathered but magnificent. The morning sun caught the carved stone details, creating shadows that seemed to dance across the ancient walls. Miguel paused at the entrance, his small hand finding his father's. "It's so big, Papa. How do we find a clue in such a big place?" "We look with our hearts as well as our eyes, son. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in plain sight." Inside, the church embraced them with cool shadows and the scent of centuries-old wood and incense. The vaulted ceiling soared overhead, supported by massive pillars that had weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical. Morning light filtered through stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns on the stone floors where countless generations had knelt in prayer. Mateo and Miguel moved slowly through the nave, their footsteps echoing softly in the sacred space. The riddle had mentioned the sign of the cross where angels keep watch, and as they explored, Mateo found himself drawn to the ornate side chapels where carved cherubs and saints maintained their eternal vigil. "Papa, look at this one," Miguel whispered, pointing to a particularly elaborate confessional booth near the altar dedicated to St. Lawrence. The carved wooden structure was decorated with intricate religious symbols, and above it, a painted angel seemed to watch over the space with gentle eyes. Mateo knelt down to examine the confessional more closely, running his fingers along the carved details. The wood was dark with age, polished smooth by centuries of use. As he traced the outline of a decorative cross, he felt something shift slightly under his touch. A small panel, no larger than his palm, moved inward with a soft click. Behind it, nestled in a cavity that seemed designed for the purpose, was a small medallion attached to a tarnished silver chain. The medallion bore the same symbols they had seen in Lucia's mural stars, arranged in a specific pattern around a compass rose. "You found it?" Miguel's excitement was barely contained in a whisper. Mateo lifted the medallion carefully, feeling its weight in his palm. The metal was warm, as if it had been waiting for this moment. On the reverse side, delicate engraving spelled out a message in Latin: Veritas et Caritas, truth and charity. "What does it mean, Papa?" Before Mateo could answer, a gentle voice spoke from behind them. "It means that real strength comes from truth and love for others." They turned to find an elderly priest approaching, his lined face kind but curious. Father Rodriguez had served San Agustin for more than 30 years, and his presence in the church felt as natural as the stone pillars themselves. "I'm sorry, Father. We were just exploring our heritage, I hope." The priest's eyes fixed on the medallion in Mateo's hand, and a flicker of recognition crossed his features. "That's a very old piece. Where did you find it?" Mateo hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "It was hidden in the confessional. We're following some clues about Manila's history." Father Rodriguez nodded slowly, his expression growing thoughtful. "Ah, you must be connected to the Cruz family research. Don Carlos mentioned that someone might come looking for his historical artifacts." "Don Carlos?" "Carlos Mendoza, a very generous man who supported our church for many years before his death. He was passionate about preserving Filipino heritage, always talking about the importance of passing historical treasures to the right people." The priest paused, studying Mateo's face. You have an honest look about you. Don Carlos said I would recognize the right person when I met them. Miguel tugged on his father's sleeve. Papa, is Don Carlos Lucia's papa? Father Rodriguez's eyebrows rose with surprise. You know little Lucia, such a sweet child. She used to come here with her great-grandfather every Sunday. Don Carlos doted on her, always teaching her about the old stories and traditions. The pieces were beginning to form a picture that both thrilled and concerned Mateo. This wasn't a child's gamete, was a carefully orchestrated plan, designed by a man who had taken great care to ensure his legacy would find its way to someone worthy. Father, was Don Carlos really as wealthy as people say? Wealthy in many ways, the priest replied diplomatically. But more importantly, he was generous. He funded scholarships, supported historic preservation, helped many families in need. His heart was always with the people of Manila. As they spoke, Mateo became aware of movement near the church entrance. A well-dressed man in an expensive suit had entered, his eyes scanning the interior with the methodical attention of someone searching for something specific. There was something about his bearing confident, entitled, predatory, that made Mateo instinctively protective. Father, is there another way out of the church? The priest followed Mateo's gaze, and his expression grew concerned. Yes, through the sacristy. Is there trouble? I'm not sure, but I think it's better to be careful. Father Rodriguez led them quickly toward the rear of the church, moving with surprising agility for his age. As they walked, he pressed a small piece of paper into Mateo's hand. Don Carlos left instructions. If anyone came seeking his historical artifacts, I was to give them this. He said it would help them understand the true nature of their quest. The paper contained another riddle, written in the same elegant hand as the first. Where the hero's words still echo, and his sacrifice is remembered, seek the monument to freedom beneath the morning star. Rizal Park, Miguel said immediately, his young mind quick to make the connection. Very good, son. Mateo felt a surge of pride in his boy's intelligence, even as concern grew about the man who had been watching them in the church. They slipped out through the sacristy exit, Father Rodriguez, ensuring they weren't followed. In the narrow alley behind the church, Mateo paused to catch his breath and think about their next move. Papa, who was that man in the church? I don't know, Majo, but I think there are people who want to find the same treasure we're looking for, and they might not have good intentions. The medallion felt heavier in his pocket now, weighted with responsibility and possibility. As they made their way toward the main road to catch transportation to Rizal Park, Mateo couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The adventure that had begun with a child's whispered request was becoming something larger and more dangerous than he had imagined. But looking at Miguel's excited face, seeing the way this quest was already teaching his son about history and courage, Mateo knew they had crossed a line from which there was no retreat. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, guided by the wisdom of a man they had never met, but who seemed to understand exactly what kind of people they were. Rizal Park stretched before them like a green heart in the center of Manila's urban pulse, its wide lawns and shaded pathways offering respite from the city's constant motion. The monument to José Rizal stood at the park's center, marking the spot where the Philippines' greatest hero had faced execution with courage that inspired a nation. Miguel walked beside his father with renewed energy, the morning's adventure having temporarily lifted the weight from his small chest. Papa, tell me again about José Rizal. He was a doctor, a writer, and a dreamer, my Joe. But most importantly, he believed that education and peaceful resistance could free our people from oppression. He wrote books that opened people's minds, and even when they threatened to kill him for his ideas, he never stopped believing in what was right. They approached the towering monument, its bronze figure of Rizal standing calm and dignified despite knowing his fate. The base of the monument was inscribed with his final poem, Mi Ultimo Adios, words that had become a testament to sacrifice for the greater good. Where the hero's words still echo, Mateo murmured, reading Father Rodriguez's riddle again. Beneath the morning star. Miguel studied the monument with the intensity of a young detective. "Papa, look at the base. There are different stones, and some of them have stars carved on them." Mateo knelt beside his son, running his hands along the monument's foundation. Sure enough, several of the cornerstone blocks bore carved stars, but only one faced east, toward the morning sun. As his fingers traced the star's outline, he felt the same subtle give that had revealed the medallion at San Agustin. The stone shifted slightly, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was what appeared to be a letter written on aged paper. Mateo carefully extracted the document, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded what looked like a replica of correspondence from Rizal himself. The letter contained a coded message, with certain words underlined in a pattern that seemed random until Miguel pointed out the sequence. "Papa, the underlined words, if you read just those, they make a sentence. Where, the heroes, words, still, echo, seek, the library of knowledge." Mateo felt a surge of pride in his son's perceptiveness. "The National Library. Miguel, you're brilliant." As they prepared to leave the park, a woman approached them with the casual confidence of someone used to getting what she wanted. She was perhaps 40, well-dressed but not ostentatiously so, with the kind of smile that suggested professional competence rather than warmth. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help noticing your interest in the monument. Are you historians, by any chance?" Mateo's instincts, sharpened by the morning's encounter at the church, immediately went on alert. "Just a father teaching his son about our heritage." "How wonderful. I'm Sofia Vega, and I work with a cultural preservation group. We're always excited to meet families who appreciate historical research." She extended her hand, and Mateo shook it briefly, noting the expensive watch and manicured nails that suggested her cultural preservation group was well funded. "It's nice to meet you, Miss Vega, but we need to be going." Of course. But if you don't mind me asking, what drew you specifically to the Monuments Foundation? Most tourists focus on the statue itself." Miguel, with the innocent honesty of childhood, piped up before his father could stop him. "We're following clues about treasure. A girl named Lucia is helping us find things that her papa hid." Sophia's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, her professional smile becoming slightly more fixed. "How fascinating. A treasure hunt. And this girl, she's been quite helpful?" "Miguel," Mateo said gently but firmly, "we should save our stories for later." "But Papa, maybe Miss Vega could help us. She knows about history." Sophia crouched down to Miguel's level, her voice taking on the tone adults used when they wanted to seem trustworthy to children. "I would love to help, Miguel. Historical treasures are exactly what my organization works to preserve. Perhaps you could tell me more about these clues you're following." Every parental instinct Mateo possessed began screaming warnings. There was something about the way Sophia's eyes remained calculating even as her voice grew warm, something about how quickly she had appeared after they found the letter. "Thank you for the offer, but we're really just exploring as a family project. Nothing serious." Sophia straightened, her smile never wavering. "Of course. But if you change your mind, here's my card. Historical preservation is important work, and sometimes amateur treasure hunters can inadvertently damage valuable artifacts." The business card was expensive, embossed with gold lettering that identified Sophia as a cultural heritage consultant. But it was the logo that made Mateo's blood run cold, the same symbol pattern they had seen on the medallion and in Lucia's mural. "We'll keep that in mind," he said carefully, pocketing the card while mentally noting never to contact this woman. As they walked away from the monument, Miguel looked up at his father with confusion. "Papa, why didn't you want to tell her about our adventure? She seemed nice." "Sometimes, Mijo, people who seem nice have different intentions than what they show on the surface. It's better to be careful with information that could be important." "Like the treasure?" "Exactly like the treasure." They caught a jeepney toward the National Library, but Mateo couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. He found himself checking reflections in windows and glancing back more often than usual, his protective instincts fully activated. The National Library of the Philippines stood as a testament to the power of knowledge, its modern facade housing centuries of Filipino history and culture. Inside, the cool air and quiet atmosphere provided a welcome change from the morning's tension. How do we find clues in a library, Papa? There are so many books. We look for books about Rizal, about Old Manila, about the Spanish colonial period. Somewhere in here is the next piece of the puzzle. They made their way to the history section, where a helpful librarian directed them to the rare books collection. Mateo explained they were researching colonial-era Manila for a school project, which was true enough to satisfy the woman's questions. In the rare books section, they found several volumes about Spanish colonial history, but it was Miguel who spotted the significant detail. Papa, this book has the same star symbol on its spine. The book was a study of Spanish colonial architecture in the Philippines, and as Mateo carefully turned its pages, looking for anything that might relate to their quest, a loose piece of paper fell from between the chapters. It was a hand-drawn map of Manila's underground tunnel system, dating from the Spanish colonial period. The map showed a network of passages connecting various important buildings, including churches, government structures, and private residences. Most intriguingly, several locations were marked with the same star symbol they had been following. Papa, look at this tunnel. It goes from Fort Santiago all the way to the old post office. Mateo studied the map more carefully, his mind racing with possibilities. The tunnel system would have allowed for secret movement during times of political unrest, but it might also provide a way to hide valuable items away from prying eyes. A notation in the margin, written in the same elegant handwriting they had seen before, provided their next clue. Where the hero languished and freedom was born, seek the compass that points not north, but toward justice. Fort Santiago, Miguel said immediately. That's where José Rizal was imprisoned, before they executed him. As they prepared to leave the library, Mateo noticed Sofia Vega entering the building, her eyes scanning the interior with the same methodical search pattern they had witnessed at the church. This was no coincidence, they were definitely being tracked. Miguel, we need to leave quietly, through the back exit. Is it the lady from the park? Yes, son, and I don't think she's really interested in helping us preserve history. They slipped out through the library's rear entrance, the tunnel map safely tucked away with their other clues. The pattern was becoming clear. Don Carlos had created an elaborate trail that would teach worthy seekers about Philippine history while testing their character and commitment. But they weren't the only ones following the trail, and the stakes were clearly higher than Mateo had initially understood. As they made their way toward Fort Santiago, he found himself wondering what exactly they were walking into and whether his desire to give Miguel an adventure was putting his son in real danger. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city, and somewhere in those shadows, people with less noble intentions were closing in on the same treasure that had captured their hearts and imagination. Fort Santiago loomed before them like a monument to resilience, its ancient walls having witnessed centuries of struggle, hope, and sacrifice. The massive stone gates that had once protected Spanish colonial power now welcomed visitors seeking to understand the complex history of their nation. But for Mateo and Miguel, these walls held the promise of answers and the growing certainty that they were part of something much larger than a simple treasure hunt. Miguel's breathing had grown slightly labored from the day's excitement and exertion, so Mateo found them a shaded bench near the entrance where his son could use his inhaler while they studied the tunnel map more carefully. Papa, look how the tunnels connect everything. It's like a secret city underneath the real city. The Spanish were very clever, Mijo. They built these passages so they could move safely during times of trouble. But I think Don Carlos was even more clever, using them to hide his clues where only someone truly dedicated would find them. A tour group was gathering near the main entrance, led by a guide whose enthusiastic voice carried across the courtyard. Mateo made a quick decision they would join the tour, blend in with the crowd, and use the cover to explore more freely. Would you like to learn about heroes and prisoners, Miguel? They joined the group, just as the guide began explaining the fort's transformation from Spanish stronghold to American military installation to Japanese prison during World War II. The stories were sobering tales of courage and suffering that gave weight to the stones beneath their feet. This is where José Rizal spent his final days. The guide explained as they entered the cell that had been preserved as a shrine. He used his time here not for despair, but for writing and reflection, preparing the words that would inspire a nation. Mateo felt the medallion warm against his chest as they stood in the small chamber where their greatest hero had faced his mortality with grace. The riddle had mentioned where the hero languished, and standing in this sacred space, he understood that they were meant to find something here. As the tour group moved on, Mateo and Miguel lingered behind, ostensibly so Miguel could catch his breath, but actually so they could examine the cell more carefully. The afternoon light slanted through the small window, creating patterns on the stone floor that seemed almost intentional. Papa, the compass that points not north but toward justice, what could that mean? Mateo studied the cell's sparse furnishings and the replica of Rizal's personal effects. There, among the simple items that had comforted the hero in his final days, was an ornate compass. But as Miguel had suspected, this was no ordinary navigational instrument. The compass housing was decorated with the familiar star pattern, and when Mateo lifted it carefully, he discovered that it indeed pointed not toward magnetic north, but toward a specific direction that seemed to align with one of the fort's interior walls. Following the compass's guidance, they found themselves standing before a section of stone wall that looked identical to all the others, except for one small detail, a loose stone at about waist height that bore the faint outline of a star. The stone came away easily in Mateo's hands, revealing a hollow space behind it. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, was a manuscript page that made both father and son gasp in amazement. The page contained a detailed map of Manila's underground tunnel system, far more comprehensive than the simple drawing they had found in the library. This map showed not just the tunnels, but also marked specific chambers, storage areas, and what appeared to be a central hub located directly beneath the old post office building. Papa, it's like a whole world down there. It is, son, a world that Don Carlos understood very well. As Mateo studied the manuscript, he became aware of voices approaching not tourists, but people speaking in low, urgent tones. He quickly tucked the map away and guided Miguel toward one of the fort's many shadowed alcoves. A man in an expensive suit, the same man they had seen at San Agustin Church, entered the cell area, accompanied by two others who moved with the fluid grace of trained security personnel. Even from their hiding place, Mateo could hear the authority in the man's voice. "I don't care what it costs, Ramirez. We need to find those documents before some amateur treasure hunter stumbles onto something they can't handle. The Mendoza endowment is too important to leave to chance." "Sir, our contacts say the girl has been spotted with a street vendor and his son. They're following the clues, but they don't understand what they're really looking for. Then we'll have to educate them, preferably before they lead Sofia's people to the same information." Mateo's blood chilled as he realized they were discussing him and Miguel. These weren't just random treasure seekers, they were organized, well-funded, and apparently competing with Sofia's group for the same prize. What about the girl? Lucia Mendoza. She's the key to everything. Carlos was clever, but he was also sentimental. He designed this whole elaborate game to find someone worthy, but in the end, it all comes down to blood relationships and legal inheritance. Get the girl, and we get control of the endowment. Miguel pressed closer to his father, his young mind understanding enough to know they were in serious danger. Mateo wrapped his arm around his son, thinking frantically about how to get them out of the fort without being seen. The men's voices grew fainter as they moved to examine other parts of the cell, giving Mateo and Miguel a chance to slip away. They made their way carefully through the fort's corridors, using the cover of other tourist groups to mask their movement. But as they approached the main exit, Mateo spotted Sofia Vega near the entrance, her eyes scanning each person leaving the fort. They were trapped between two groups of people who clearly meant them harm. "Papa, what do we do?" "We use the tunnels, Maijo, just like the heroes did when they needed to escape." According to the map they had found, one of the tunnel entrances was located in the fort's lower level, near the old ammunition storage areas. The tourist route didn't normally include these sections, but Matteo had noticed maintenance stairs leading downward during their exploration. They made their way carefully to the lower level, past roped-off areas, and signs warning tourists away from unstable sections. The air grew cooler and damper as they descended, carrying the scent of centuries-old stone and the whisper of underground water. "Papa, I'm scared." "I know, son. But remember what we learned about José Rizal Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you are afraid." The tunnel entrance was exactly where the map indicated, hidden behind what appeared to be a solid wall, but was actually a cleverly disguised door. The Spanish colonial compass from Rizal's cell had become warm in Matteo's pocket, and when he held it near the wall, it began to vibrate slightly. Following the compass's guidance, Matteo found the hidden mechanismus stone that pushed inward, causing a section of the wall to swing open on well-oiled hinges. The passage beyond stretched into darkness, but fresh air flowing from within suggested it was still passable. "The tunnels are real, Miguel. Don Carlos wasn't just hiding treasure, he was preserving history." They entered the passage, using Matteo's phone's flashlight to navigate the ancient corridor. The walls were lined with stone blocks fitted so precisely that mortar was barely visible, a testament to the skill of colonial-era engineers. Every few meters, small alcoves contained what appeared to be oil lamp fixtures, suggesting the tunnels had been designed for regular use. As they walked, following the map's guidance toward the post office, Miguel's excitement overcame his fear. "Papa, this is like the adventure stories you tell me, but it's real." "It is real, son, and it's teaching us that our ancestors were very clever people who understood the value of planning for the future." The tunnel system was more extensive than either had imagined, with branches leading off in multiple directions and occasional chambers that might once have served as storage areas or meeting places. But the main passage was clearly marked with the star symbols they had been following, ensuring they stayed on the correct path. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, they reached a junction where multiple tunnels converged. According to the map, they were now directly beneath intramuros, with passages leading to the cathedral, the governor's palace, and their destination, the old post office. "We're almost there, Miguel, but I want you to promise me something. If we encounter those people again, if anything seems dangerous, you run back the way we came and find help. Promise me." "I promise, Papa, but I think we're going to be okay. I think Don Carlos is watching over us." The final stretch of tunnel led upward, ending at another hidden door mechanism. When Matteo activated it, they found themselves in what appeared to be a basement storage area beneath the post office building. Overhead, they could hear the sounds of normal daily activity, footsteps, voices, the everyday business of a government building. But here in the basement, surrounded by file boxes and forgotten furniture, they had found something extraordinary. The map indicated that the central chamber was located behind the far wall, and sure enough, the compass pointed directly toward what appeared to be another hidden entrance. This final door was more elaborate than the others, requiring not just the compass but also the medallion they had found at San Agustin Church. When both artifacts were placed in specific positions, the walls slid away to reveal a chamber that took their breath away. The room beyond was Don Carlos's true Masterpiecea preservation archive, containing documents, artifacts, and artwork that told the story of Manila's development over centuries. But more than a museum, it was clearly designed as a legacy vault, a place where someone with vision and resources had gathered the tools needed to preserve and restore their city's heritage. "Papa, look at all this. It's not just treasurettes, like a whole library of our history." Miguel was right. This wasn't about gold or jewels, it was about something far more valuable. Don Carlos had assembled the legal documents, historical records, and financial resources needed to undertake massive heritage preservation projects throughout Manila. And at the center of the chamber, on a simple wooden desk, sat a leather-bound journal containing what appeared to be Don Carlos's final testament and the true explanation of his elaborate treasure hunt. The journal's pages were filled with Don Carlos's elegant handwriting, documenting not just his plans for the endowment, but his deep love for Manila and his concerns about its future. As Mateo read aloud to Miguel, they began to understand the true scope of what they had discovered. "My dear friend," the journal began, "for that is what you must be if you have successfully followed my trail of clues. You have demonstrated patience, intelligence, and most importantly, the willingness to pursue knowledge and help others, even when the path was uncertain." Miguel listened with rapt attention as his father continued reading. The journal explained that Don Carlos had spent his final years watching Manila's historical sites deteriorate, its colonial-era buildings crumble, and its cultural artifacts disappear into private collections or foreign museums. "I could simply leave my fortune to the government," the journal continued, "but bureaucracy moves slowly and money often finds its way into the wrong pockets. Instead, I have chosen to create a treasure hunt that will identify someone with the character to use these resources properly." The chamber around them contained more than just documents. It held architectural plans for restoration projects, contracts with craftsmen who specialized in historical preservation, and detailed surveys of buildings throughout Manila that were in desperate need of attention. But it was the financial documentation that truly revealed the magnitude of Don Carlos's vision. The endowment wasn't just 9 billion pesos, it was a carefully structured fund designed to generate income for perpetual heritage preservation work throughout the Philippines. "Papa, this means we could fix all the old buildings, save all the historical places that are falling down." "It means someone could, mijo. The question is whether that someone should be us." As they explored the chamber further, they discovered that Don Carlos had anticipated the moral complexity of his test. A section of the journal was devoted to the burden of responsibility that would come with controlling such resources. "The person who completes this quest will face a choice," Don Carlos had written. "They can claim a portion of the endowment for their personal use enough to solve their immediate financial problems and secure their family's future. Or they can accept the role of guardian, using the entire fund for its intended purpose while receiving only a modest salary for their stewardship." Mateo felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. The money could solve all their problems: Miguel's medical care, their housing situation, the constant stress of daily survival. But it could also do something far greater for thousands of other families throughout Manila. Miguel was examining a display case containing historical artifacts when he made a discovery that changed everything. "Papa, look at this photograph." The old black-and-white picture showed a man standing in front of the very chamber they now occupied, but decades earlier when the equipment and furnishings were new. Standing beside him was a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, with familiar dark eyes and a serious expression. "Is that Lucia's grandfather?" Mateo studied the photograph more carefully. The resemblance was unmistakable. This was clearly Lucia with Don Carlos, but the photo had to be at least 60 years old, based on the clothing and image quality. "That's impossible, Miguel. Lucia can't be more than 7 years old now." But even as he said it, Mateo remembered the depth in the girl's eyes, the way she had moved through the mansion with complete familiarity, her knowledge of things that no modern child should understand. A chill ran down his spine as he began to consider possibilities that defied rational explanation. The sound of footsteps in the tunnel above interrupted his thoughts. Someone had discovered their route and was following them into the underground passages. Voices echoed in the stone corridors, multiple people, moving with purpose and urgency. "We need to leave, Miguel, right now." But as they gathered the essential documents from Don Carlos's desk, they realized there was a problem. The chamber had only one entrance, and their pursuers were between them and the tunnel system they had used to arrive. "Papa, what about that?" Miguel pointed to what appeared to be an old dumbwaiter system in the corner of the chamber, probably used to transport materials between the basement and upper floors of the post office building. The mechanism was ancient but well maintained, clearly part of Don Carlos's preparations for this eventual discovery. A hand crank system allowed manual operation, and the shaft extended upward into darkness. "It's worth trying, son. Better than waiting here to be found." The voices in the tunnels were growing closer, and now they could make out individual words. Sofia Vega was directing a search team, her previous facade of cultural preservation completely abandoned. "The entrance has to be here somewhere. The vault is the only place that makes sense for the final hiding place." Mateo helped Miguel into the dumbwaiter compartment, which was just large enough for both of them if they crouched together. The ascent was slow and nerve-wracking, the old pulleys creaking with each turn of the hand crank. They emerged into what appeared to be a storage closet on the post office's main floor, the sounds of normal government business filtering through the walls. But their relief was short-lived as they stepped out of the closet. They found themselves face to face with the well-dressed man from the church and fort, flanked by his security team. "Mr. Cruz, I presume, and young Miguel, you've led us quite a chase." The man's voice was cultured, professional, but carried an undertone of threat that made Mateo instinctively step in front of his son. "I'm Victor Delacroix, and I represent certain interests that have a legitimate claim to the Mendoza endowment. You've been very helpful in locating the documentation we need, but I'm afraid this is where your involvement ends. We haven't done anything wrong. We're just following historical clues." "Of course not, and we appreciate your civic-minded assistance. However, the endowment involves complex legal and financial matters that are beyond the scope of amateur treasure hunting. We'll need you to hand over any documents you may have found." Miguel pressed closer to his father, his small hand gripping the journal they had taken from Don Carlos's chamber. There was something about Mr. Delacroix that reminded Mateo of the corrupt officials and business people who had made his life so difficult after Carmen's death-smooth words hiding selfish intentions. "And if we refuse?" Delacroix's smile never wavered, but his eyes grew cold. "Let's not make this more complicated than necessary. You have a sick child to think about, Mr. Cruz. Medical care is expensive, and accidents can happen to people who get involved in situations beyond their understanding." The threat was clear, and Mateo felt a familiar rage building, the same anger he'd experienced when landlords threatened eviction, when pharmacists demanded payment he didn't have, when the world seemed designed to crush people who couldn't fight back. But this time, he wasn't powerless. This time, he held something that could change not just his life, but the lives of countless others. "Miguel," he said quietly, "do you remember what José Rizal said about standing up for what's right?" "Yes, Papa. He said that cowardice is worse than death." Delacroix's expression shifted, recognizing that his intimidation tactics were not having the desired effect. "Mr. Cruz, please be reasonable. Think about your son's future." "I am thinking about his future, and I'm thinking about the future of every family in Manila who deserves better than people like you." The standoff continued, tension building in the small storage room, when a new voice cut through the silence. "Actually, Mr. Delacroix, I think you'll find that the legal situation is far more complex than you've suggested." Sofia Vega emerged from the stairwell, having found her way up from the basement chamber. But she wasn't alone. Several men in dark suits flanked her, and their bearings suggested law enforcement rather than criminal intent. The game was about to change in ways none of them had anticipated. The storage room suddenly felt impossibly small as two opposing forces faced each other across its cramped confines. Delacroix's security team tensed, hands moving toward concealed weapons, while Sofia's companions positioned themselves with the practiced efficiency of law enforcement officers. "Miss Vega," Delacroix said carefully, his cultured voice betraying the first hints of uncertainty, "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I'm sure you weren't, Victor, though I suspect you should have been." Sofia's entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the friendly cultural preservation consultant, replaced by someone who carried unmistakable authority. "Gentlemen, please show Mr. Delacroix your identification." The men with Sofia, produced badges that identified them as agents from the Bureau of Internal Revenue's Financial Intelligence Unit. Suddenly, the dynamics of the confrontation shifted dramatically. "Mr. Cruz," Sophia continued, her voice now addressing Mateo directly, "I owe you an apology. I haven't been entirely honest about who I am or why I've been following your treasure hunt." Miguel pressed closer to his father, confused by the rapidly changing situation. Mateo kept one protective arm around his son, while maintaining eye contact with Sophia, unsure whether this new development represented help or a different kind of threat. "My name is Sofia Vega, but I'm not a cultural heritage consultant. I'm a financial crimes investigator, and I've been tracking Victor Delacroix's organization for the past 18 months. Delacroix's face remained impassive, but Mateo noticed sweat beading on the man's forehead despite the room's cool temperature. "You see," Sophia continued, "Mr. Delacroix represents a network of individuals who specialize in locating and appropriating unclaimed assets, particularly those belonging to deceased wealthy individuals who may not have left clear inheritance instructions. They've been hunting for the Mendoza endowment ever since Don Carlos's death 3 years ago." "This is preposterous," Delacroix interjected, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I represent legitimate business interests with valid legal claims. You represent a criminal organization that has stolen millions of pesos from Filipino families by manipulating inheritance laws and corrupting government officials." Sophia's words cut through his protests like a blade. "We've been building a case against your network, but we needed evidence of your methods and identification of your local contacts." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place for Mateo, but the picture they formed was far more complex than he had imagined. "You used us as bait." "Not exactly. When we learned that someone was following Don Carlos's treasure hunt, we initially thought you might be working with Delacroix's people. But surveillance quickly revealed that you and Miguel were exactly what you appeared to be, father and son, following clues out of curiosity and hope. But you've been watching us, following us, putting my son in danger." Sophia's expression softened slightly. "We've been protecting you, Mr. Cruz. Delacroix's organization doesn't hesitate to eliminate obstacles, and once they realized you were successfully following the clues, you became a serious threat to their plans." Miguel tugged on his father's sleeve. "Papa, I don't understand. Are we in trouble?" Before Mateo could answer, a new voice cut through the tensiona voice that made everyone in the room freeze. "Nobody is in trouble, Miguel, but there are some things about this treasure hunt that haven't been explained properly." Lucia stood in the doorway, but something about her presence had changed dramatically. Gone was the uncertain child who had first approached them outside the post office. In her place stood someone who moved with quiet authority, her dark eyes holding depths of knowledge that seemed impossible for her apparent age. "Lucia!" Miguel broke away from his father and ran toward the girl, but she held up a small hand to stop him. "Before you come closer, Miguel, there's something you need to understand about who I really am." She reached into her simple dress and withdrew a locket that Mateo had never seen before, an ornate silver piece that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. As she opened it, the chamber filled with a soft glow that made everyone present step back in amazement. Inside the locket were 2 photographs. One showed Don Carlos as a young man, standing beside a woman of extraordinary beauty. The other showed the same woman, but older, holding a baby that bore an unmistakable resemblance to Lucia. "My name is Lucia Esperanza Mendoza, and I am Don Carlos's great-granddaughter, but I am not 7 years old." The locket's glow intensified, and as they watched in stunned silence, Lucia's appearance began to shift. The child's features remained, but something in her bearing, her expression, her very presence transformed before their eyes. "I am 17 years old, and I have been the guardian of my great-grandfather's legacy since his death. The child you have been seeing is a projection, a way to approach people without triggering their adult skepticism and greed." Delacroix's team had backed against the far wall, their training apparently not having prepared them for encounters with the supernatural. Even his security personnel looked ready to flee. "This is impossible," Delacroix whispered. "People don't just change like that." "Don Carlos was a man of science as well as vision," Lucia continued, her voice now carrying the wisdom of someone far beyond her apparent years. "He studied the old Filipino traditions, the stories of spiritual guardians and ancestral protectors. He believed that love and purpose could transcend the normal limitations of existence." Sophia's investigative training was struggling to process what she was witnessing. "Are you saying that you're some kind of spirit?" "I'm saying that death is not always the end of responsibility. Don Carlos died, knowing that his endowment needed a guardian, someone who would ensure it reached the right hands. I volunteered to serve that purpose, even though it meant remaining bound to this world, instead of moving on to whatever comes next." The practical implications of this revelation were staggering. If Lucia was the legal heir to the Mendoza fortune, then Delacroix's entire operation was not just criminal but futile. "The endowment cannot be stolen or claimed by outsiders," Lucia explained, "because it requires the willing consent of its guardian. And I have been testing potential recipients for 3 years, waiting for someone who would understand that true wealth comes from helping others." She turned to face Mateo directly, her young features serious with the weight of centuries of Filipino wisdom. "You have passed every test, Mateo Cruz. You chose to help a lost child rather than worry about your own problems. You included your son in learning about our heritage. You protected historical artifacts instead of selling them. You chose courage over safety when confronted by those who would misuse power. But I don't know anything about managing that kind of money, about preservation projects, about any of this. You know about love, about sacrifice, about doing what's right even when it's difficult. The rest can be learned." Delacroix made a sudden move toward the exit, but Sophia's agents were ready for him. Within moments, he and his team were in custody, their operation finally exposed and ended. "What happens now?" Miguel asked, his young mind struggling to process the miraculous events he had witnessed. Lucia smiled, and for a moment she was simply a child again, delighted by adventure and possibility. "Now, Miguel, your father has a choice to make. He can accept the responsibility of guarding the endowment and using it to restore Manila's heritage, or he can take a reward for his help and return to his normal life." The locket's glow faded, and Lucia returned to her apparent age of 7, but the knowledge in her eyes remained. She had shown them the truth of who she was and what the treasure hunt had really been about. "There's one more thing you should know," she said quietly. "If your father accepts this responsibility, he won't be working alone. I will remain as his advisor and partner in this work, for as long as it takes to fulfill my great-grandfather's vision." Mateo looked down at Miguel, then around the room at the evidence of Don Carlos's careful planning, then finally at Lucia, who represented both the past and the future of their beloved city. The choice before him would define not just his own life, but the kind of legacy he would leave for his son, and the kind of world Miguel would inherit. In his pocket, Carmen's photograph seemed to whisper encouragement, reminding him that love sometimes calls us to purposes greater than ourselves. The weight of the decision settled over Mateo like a mantle of responsibility that felt both terrifying and strangely familiar. In the sudden quiet that followed Delacroix's arrest, the storage room seemed to pulse with the accumulated hopes and dreams of generations. Sophia's agents had efficiently removed Delacroix and his team, leaving behind only Sophia herself, who was carefully documenting the scene for her investigation. But her professional duties couldn't completely mask her fascination with what she had witnessed. "Mr. Cruz," she said quietly, "for what it's worth, I've been watching you for weeks, and I believe Don Carlos chose well. You have something that can't be taught or bought, the ability to see beyond your own immediate needs." Lucia approached Mateo with a leather portfolio that seemed to have materialized from nowhere, though he suspected it had been hidden in the storage room all along. "This contains everything you need to understand what accepting the guardianship would mean. But before you decide, there's something else you should see." She led them back down to Don Carlos's chamber, which had been transformed during their absence above ground. Where before there had been a simple archive, now the space glowed with soft light that revealed the full scope of the philanthropist's vision. The walls were covered with detailed plans for restoration projects throughout Manila churches that could be returned to their original splendor, colonial-era houses that could be saved from demolition, public spaces that could be redesigned to honor their historical significance while serving modern needs. "Papa, look at all the places we could help," Miguel whispered, his young imagination immediately grasping the possibilities. But it was the financial documentation that truly revealed the magnitude of the choice before them. The endowment wasn't just a static sum of money, it was a carefully structured investment portfolio designed to generate income in perpetuity. The principal would remain untouched, but the interest and dividends could fund preservation work throughout the Philippines for generations. Don Carlos spent his final years consulting with economists, lawyers, and preservation specialists. Lucia explained, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had been intimately involved in those discussions. He designed this not as a charitable gift, but as a sustainable engine for cultural preservation. Mateo studied the documents with growing amazement. The yearly income from the endowment would be more than enough to fund major restoration projects, while providing a comfortable living for whoever served as its guardian. It was ambitious beyond anything he had imagined, yet meticulously planned down to the smallest detail. "What happened to your family, Lucia? How did you end up as the guardian instead of your parents or grandparents?" Her expression grew sad, and for a moment she was simply a child remembering loss. "My grandmother died when I was 12, and my parents were killed in a car accident 2 years later. Don Carlos was all I had left, and when he died, I couldn't bear the thought of leaving this world without ensuring his dreams would come true." The tragedy in her story made Miguel reach out to take her hand, his natural compassion overcoming any lingering confusion about her true nature. "But if I accept this responsibility," Mateo said carefully, "what happens to you? Do you finally get to rest?" "Only when the work is complete, when Manila's heritage is truly secure. But that could take decades, and I've made peace with that choice." As they spoke, Mateo became aware of sounds from the tunnel's footsteps and voices that suggested they were about to have more company. But these voices were different from the threatening tones of Delacroix's people. These sounded excited, curious, hopeful. "Ms. Vega," a young man's voice echoed through the passage. "We found the entrance, and there are people here who say they can help explain what we're looking for." Sophia appeared at the chamber entrance, followed by several people who made Mateo's heart swell with recognition and gratitude. Mrs. Santos was there, moving carefully but determinedly through the tunnel. Dr. Reyes had come as well, his medical bag slung over his shoulder out of habit. Even Father Rodriguez from San Agustin Church had made the journey underground. "Mateo, my boy," Mrs. Santos said with a broad smile, "when the government investigators came asking about you and Miguel, we told them they'd better be looking to help you, not hurt you." Dr. Reyes immediately went to Miguel, checking his breathing and color with the automatic concern of someone who had been caring for the boy for years. "How are you feeling, young man? This has been quite an adventure for someone with asthma." "I'm okay, doctor. The medicine is working, and Papa says adventures are good for building character." Father Rodriguez surveyed the chamber with wonder, his eyes taking in the religious artifacts and historical documents that filled the space. "Don Carlos mentioned that he was working on something important for the church and for Manila, but I never imagined anything like this." "How did you all find us?" Mateo asked. "Ms. Vega's investigation led them to everyone who had been helping you," Mrs. Santos explained. "When they told us what was really happening, we insisted on coming to support you. Whatever decision you make, you should know that your community stands behind you." The presence of these people, his chosen family, the support network that had sustained him through the darkest times, gave Mateo a clarity he hadn't possessed before. This wasn't just about him and Miguel anymore. It was about the kind of community they all wanted to build together. Lucia watched the reunion with satisfaction, as if this gathering had been part of her plan all along. Don Carlos believed that real preservation work required community involvement. He hoped that whoever accepted the guardianship would understand that. Dr. Reyes had been examining some of the medical equipment in the chamber. Apparently, Don Carlos had been concerned about healthcare access as well as historic preservation. Mateo, with resources like this, we could establish free clinics throughout the old neighborhoods, places where families like yours could get proper care without worrying about cost. And the church could partner with the foundation to provide educational programs. Father Rodriguez added, we could teach children about their heritage while helping their families with practical needs. Mrs. Santos nodded approvingly. This is how communities should work, everyone helping everyone else, building something better for the next generation. Miguel looked up at his father with shining eyes. Papa, we could help everyone, couldn't we? Just like you always helped me. The documents in the leather portfolio detailed exactly how such community involvement could work. Don Carlos had envisioned a foundation that would employ local people, train them in preservation techniques, and create a sustainable economy around cultural heritage maintenance. But there was also a personal dimension to the choice that couldn't be ignored. Accepting the guardianship would mean a complete transformation of their lives, from day-to-day survival to long-term stewardship of something larger than themselves. The foundation would provide you with a house, Lucia explained. One of the historic properties that Don Carlos acquired for restoration. You and Miguel would live there while overseeing the preservation work. The foundation's income would cover all your expenses, including Miguel's medical care, his education, everything you need. It was almost too good to believe. Security, purpose, the ability to help others on a scale he had never imagined possible. But it was also overwhelming. A responsibility that felt enormous for someone who had been counting pesos for medicine just days ago. What if I make mistakes? What if I'm not smart enough or educated enough to handle something this important? You won't be alone, Dr. Reyes assured him. The foundation would employ experts, advisors, people who understand the technical aspects of the work. Your role would be to ensure that the heart of the mission remains pure, that the work truly serves the community rather than ego or profit. Sophia had been listening to the conversation while continuing to document the chamber's contents. Mr. Cruz, in my investigation of financial crimes, I've seen what happens when large sums of money fall into the wrong hands, but I've also seen what happens when they fall into the right hands. You have something that most wealthy people lack. You understand what it means to struggle, to need help, to depend on others' kindness. The evening light filtering down through the post office building above created shifting patterns on the chamber walls, and in those patterns, Mateo seemed to see the faces of all the people who could benefit from Don Carlos's vision. Children who could grow up learning about their heritage, families who could receive medical care, elderly people who could live with dignity in preserved historical communities. There's something else you should know, Lucia said quietly. If you accept this responsibility, it doesn't have to be forever. When Miguel is grown, when you feel your work is done, you can pass the guardianship to someone else, but it should be someone you trust completely, someone who shares the values that brought you here. Miguel tugged on his father's sleeve. Papa, what would Mama want us to do? The question pierced straight to the heart of everything. Mateo pulled Carmen's photograph from his pocket, looking at her smiling face in the chamber's mystical light. He could almost hear her voice, encouraging him to be brave, to trust in their family's ability to do good in the world. The choice was no longer whether to accept the responsibility, it was whether he had the courage to trust himself with it. Mateo held Carmen's photograph against his chest, feeling the familiar weight of love and loss that had guided him through every difficult decision since her death. Around him, the chamber seemed to pulse with expectation, as if the very walls were waiting for his answer. Miguel, he said quietly, kneeling down to his son's level, this choice will change our entire lives. Are you ready for that kind of adventure? Yes, Papa, but only if you are. The simple trust in his son's voice gave Mateo the final piece of courage he needed. He stood and faced Lucia, extending his hand toward the leather portfolio that contained the Foundation's documents. "I accept the guardianship of Don Carlos's endowment, with the understanding that it will be used to preserve Manila's heritage and help our community." As his fingers touched the portfolio, the chamber filled with a warm, golden light that seemed to emanate from Lucia herself. The sensation was unlike anything Mateo had ever experienced, not just visual, but something that touched his soul with the weight of centuries of Filipino wisdom and hope. "Then it is done," Lucia said, her voice carrying an authority that transcended her apparent age. "You are now the guardian of the Mendoza Heritage Foundation, entrusted with resources that represent the accumulated dreams of generations." The portfolio opened itself in Mateo's hands, revealing documents that seemed to write themselves as he watched. Legal papers establishing him as the Foundation's director, bank authorizations giving him access to the endowment's accounts, and detailed plans for the first restoration projects appeared on pages that had been blank moments before. But it was the final document that took his breath away's letter, addressed specifically to him, written in handwriting he recognized as Don Carlos's, dated just 3 days ago despite the man's death 3 years earlier. "My dear Mateo," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you have passed every test and accepted the responsibility I hoped someone would claim. I have been watching your journey through Lucia's eyes, and I am convinced that my life's work will flourish under your guardianship." Miguel pressed closer to his father, reading along as the mystical letter continued. "You will face challenges in the coming years. There will be government officials who want to control the Foundation's resources, developers who will pressure you to sell historic properties, and critics who will question whether a former street vendor can manage such important work. But remember that character matters more than credentials, and love accomplishes more than expertise." The letter went on to provide specific guidance for the Foundation's first projects: the restoration of San Agustin Church's Baroque facade, the establishment of a medical clinic in Tondo, the creation of an educational center that would teach traditional Filipino crafts alongside modern skills. "Papa," Miguel whispered, "it's like he's still here, helping us plan everything." Mrs. Santos wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the miraculous documents appear. "Some people's love is so strong it refuses to be stopped by death." Father Rodriguez nodded solemnly. "This is what we call the communion of saints, the connection between those who have passed on and those who continue their work in this world." Dr. Reyes was examining the medical clinic plans with professional interest. "These specifications are remarkable. The equipment list, the staffing requirements, the community outreach programs, it's exactly what our neighborhood needs." But even as joy and amazement filled the chamber, Mateo felt a tremor of fear. The responsibility was enormous, and despite everyone's encouragement, he was still the same man who had been counting coins for medicine just days ago. "I don't know if I'm worthy of this trust," he said aloud, his voice carrying the honest doubt that had plagued him throughout the adventure. Lucia stepped forward, and in her hands appeared a crystal prism that seemed to capture and reflect all the light in the chamber. "Worthiness isn't something you possess, Mateo. It's something you choose every day through your actions and decisions." She placed the prism on Don Carlos's desk, where it began to project images onto the chamber wall scenes of Manila as it could be, with restored churches filled with worshippers, historic buildings serving as community centers, children learning about their heritage in beautiful, safe spaces. "This is what Don Carlos dreamed of," she continued. "Not just preservation for its own sake, but heritage that serves living communities, that gives people pride in their identity and hope for their future." The images shifted, showing specific projects that could be undertaken with the Foundation's resources. Miguel pointed excitedly at a scene showing children his age learning traditional Filipino crafts from master artisans. "Papa, look, we could help kids learn about where they come from." "Yes, son, we could help many people learn many things." Sophia had been quietly observing the mystical proceedings while maintaining her investigative objectivity. Mr. Cruz, the legal framework for this foundation is unlike anything I've seen. The documents are creating a new model for philanthropic work that prioritizes community involvement over institutional control. The Prism's projections continued, now showing the challenges they would face. Corrupt officials trying to divert funds, developers pressuring them to sell valuable properties, critics questioning their qualifications. But for every challenge, the images also showed solutions, community support, legal protections, the growing strength that comes from successful projects. The hardest part, Lucia explained, will be learning to think in decades rather than days. Street vendors become skilled at surviving moment to moment, but guardians must plan for generations. Dr. Reyes stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Mateo's shoulder. That's why you have advisors, friends, a community that believes in you. None of us succeeds alone. Mrs. Santos nodded emphatically. And you have something more important than expertise. You have the experience of struggle. You won't forget what it feels like to need help, which means you'll never stop providing it to others. Father Rodriguez added his own perspective. In the church, we believe that God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. You were chosen for this work, not because you already knew how to do it, but because you have the heart to learn. The crystal prism pulsed with brighter light, and suddenly the chamber was filled with a presence that felt unmistakably like Don Carlos himself. Though he remained invisible, his voice seemed to whisper through the space, trust in the work, trust in your community, and trust in the love that brought you here. Miguel reached up to take his father's hand. Papa, I'm proud of you for being brave enough to help people. The simple words from his son dissolved the last of Mateo's doubts. This wasn't about whether he was worthy, it was about whether he was willing to grow into worthiness through service to others. Then let's begin, he said, his voice carrying new authority and purpose. Let's start building the Manila that Don Carlos dreamed of. The prism's light suddenly intensified, filling the chamber with brilliance that seemed to penetrate every corner of their souls. When the light faded, they found themselves no longer in the underground chamber, but standing in the courtyard of a beautiful Spanish colonial house that Mateo recognized from the foundation's property documents. Welcome home, Lucia said simply, gesturing toward the restored mansion that would serve as both their residence and the foundation's headquarters. The transition from the underground chamber to their new home felt like stepping through a doorway between worlds. The colonial mansion stood before them in the evening light, its restored facade glowing with warm honey-colored stone and pristine white trim. Flowering vines climbed the walls in careful cultivation rather than wild abandonment, and the windows gleamed with the promise of new beginnings. Miguel's asthma, which had been troubling him throughout their underground adventure, seemed to ease in the clean air of the mansion's courtyard. Papa, is this really where we're going to live? It appears so, son. What do you think? I think Mama would love it. The grounds around the mansion revealed themselves to be far more extensive than Mateo had initially realized. Gardens stretched toward the back of the property, where he could see the outlines of additional buildings that would house the foundation's offices and workshop spaces. Everything spoke of careful planning and generous resources applied with intelligence and taste. Lucia led them through the main entrance, past doors of rich mahogany carved with traditional Filipino motifs. The interior was a masterpiece of restoration, work-original wooden floors polished to a warm glow, period furniture that managed to be both historically accurate and comfortable for modern living, and artwork that celebrated Filipino culture without feeling like a museum display. Don Carlos had this property restored as a model for the foundation's future projects. Lucia explained as they toured the main rooms. Every technique used here, every material chosen, every design decision can be replicated in other historic buildings throughout Manila. Dr. Reyes was examining a well-equipped medical consultation room on the ground floor. This is perfect for house calls and basic treatment. With the Foundation's resources, we could establish a network of these community health centers throughout the historic districts. Mrs. Santos had discovered a modern kitchen that maintained its colonial character while including every amenity needed for comfortable daily living. "You'll be able to cook real meals for Miguel, not just rice porridge and whatever we can afford." Father Rodriguez was studying a library that contained an extensive collection of books on Filipino history, culture, and preservation techniques. This will be invaluable for the educational programs. Children and adults alike can learn about their heritage in a space that honors that heritage. But it was the sealed endowment documents, displayed in a climate-controlled case in the mansion's study, that truly drove home the magnitude of what Mateo had accepted. The papers were formal, legal, and absolutely binding, was now the guardian of resources that could genuinely transform Manila's approach to historic preservation. Sophia, who had accompanied them to their new home to complete her investigation documentation, reviewed the legal framework with professional amazement. "The foundation structure is brilliant. The principle remains protected in perpetuity, but the income streams are designed to grow with inflation and changing economic conditions. This isn't just preservation funding, it's a sustainable engine for community development." As evening settled over their new home, Mateo found himself standing in the mansion's main courtyard, looking up at stars that seemed brighter and more hopeful than any he had seen from their old apartment. The weight of responsibility hadn't diminished, but it no longer felt crushing. Instead, it felt like the natural evolution of the love and care he had always felt for his family and community. Miguel joined him in the courtyard, his breathing easy and comfortable in the clean air. "Papa, do you think we'll be able to help a lot of people?" "I think we'll help as many people as we can, for as long as we can, in whatever ways we can." Lucia approached them from the mansion's entrance, and in the starlight she seemed to shimmer slightly, as if her connection to the physical world was maintained only by will and purpose, rather than natural law. "There's one final thing you should understand about your new role," she said quietly. "The Foundation's work will attract attention from around the world. Preservationists, historians, government officials, and others will come to study what you're doing here. You'll become an example of how community-based heritage preservation can work." The thought was both inspiring and intimidating. What if we fail? What if the projects don't work out as planned? Then you'll learn from the failures and try again. Don Carlos didn't expect perfection. He expected commitment and the willingness to keep improving. Dr. Reyes joined them in the courtyard, having completed his examination of the mansion's medical facilities. "Miguel, your new home has everything we need to manage your asthma properly. State-of-the-art air filtration, humidity control, even an emergency medical kit designed specifically for respiratory conditions." Mrs. Santos emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray of tea and fresh pastries. Apparently the mansion's pantry had been stocked in preparation for their arrival. "A proper home needs proper hospitality. Tonight we celebrate new beginnings." Father Rodriguez raised his teacup in a toast. "To Don Carlos's vision, to Mateo's courage, and to the community we'll build together." As they drank their tea under the stars, Mateo felt Carmen's presence more strongly than he had since her death. She would have loved this moment, the coming together of people who cared about each other, the promise of meaningful work ahead, the security and hope that Miguel would finally have. The transformation was complete. The struggling street vendor had become the guardian of a legacy that could last for generations. 3 months later, the morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the restored mansion's breakfast room as Mateo reviewed the Foundation's first quarterly report. The numbers told a story of remarkable progress. 3 historic buildings already under restoration, 2 community health clinics operational, and an educational center scheduled to open the following month. Miguel sat across from him, no longer the pale, wheezing child who had sold trinkets outside the post office. Proper medical care, clean air, and good nutrition had transformed his health. But more importantly, his involvement in the Foundation's work had given him a sense of purpose that strengthened his spirit as much as medicine strengthened his lungs. "Papa, look at this letter from the children," At the first clinic, Miguel held up a handwritten note decorated with colorful drawings. They want to know if they can help plant flowers around their building. What do you think we should tell them? I think we should say yes, and we should teach them about which flowers grow best in Manila and which ones their grandparents would have planted. Mateo smiled at his son's instinctive understanding of the Foundation's mission, not just to preserve the past, but to connect it meaningfully with the present and future. The breakfast room's French doors opened onto the garden where Lucia was working with a group of local artisans, teaching them traditional tile-making techniques that would be used in the restoration projects. Her age seemed to fluctuate depending on the task at hand, sometimes appearing as the 7-year-old who had first approached them, sometimes manifesting as a young woman with the knowledge and authority to direct complex preservation work. "She's remarkable," said Dr. Reyes, joining them for his weekly breakfast meeting to discuss the health clinic's progress. "The way she can communicate with everyone, from government ministers to street children, it's like she speaks each person's language perfectly." "I think she speaks the language of the heart," Mateo replied. "The language that Don Carlos taught her, about seeing people's needs and responding with love and practical help." Mrs. Santos entered with fresh coffee and the day's mail, her role in their household having evolved naturally from helpful neighbor to foundation coordinator. Her small sari-sari store had become an unofficial information center for the foundation's work, connecting community members with services and opportunities. "The mayor's office called," she announced. "They want to discuss expanding the clinic program to 5 more neighborhoods. And the Department of Tourism wants to feature our restoration work in their new cultural heritage campaign." Dr. Reyes added, "Apparently, we're becoming a model for community-based preservation throughout Southeast Asia." The recognition was gratifying, but Mateo had learned to measure success in more personal terms. The true victory was in the thank you notes from families who no longer had to choose between medicine and food, in the employment opportunities created for craftsmen whose traditional skills had been valued and preserved, in the children who were learning about their heritage through hands-on involvement in restoration work. Father Rodriguez arrived for their morning planning session, his cassock replaced by work clothes suitable for the building project he was overseeing. The restoration of San Agustin Church had become a collaboration between the foundation and the parish, creating a model for how religious and secular preservation efforts could support each other. "The new apprenticeship program is exceeding all expectations," he reported. "Young people are competing for positions learning traditional crafts, and the master artisans are delighted to pass on their knowledge to eager students." "What about the challenges?" Mateo asked, having learned that sustainable success required honest assessment of problems as well as celebration of achievements. "Some government officials are still uncomfortable with our independence," Father Rodriguez admitted. "They'd prefer to control how the Foundation's resources are allocated. And there are developers who keep making offers to buy our restored properties," Mrs. Santos added. "The prices keep going up as our success becomes more visible." These were the ongoing tensions that came with managing significant resources while maintaining community focus. Mateo had learned to navigate political pressures while staying true to the Foundation's mission, but it required constant vigilance and the support of allies who shared their values. "The important thing is that we never lose sight of why we're doing this work," he said. "Every decision should be measured against whether it serves the community and honors our heritage." Miguel looked up from his letter, writing he had been corresponding with children at all the Foundation's project sites, creating a network of young people who were learning about preservation work. "Papa, Lucia says there are similar endowments in other countries, waiting for the right guardians. Do you think our work here might inspire others?" It was a possibility that Mateo had begun to consider as international visitors arrived to study their methods. The Foundation's approach combining heritage preservation with community development, employing local people and traditional techniques, creating sustainable funding, models was being recognized as potentially replicable elsewhere. If our work helps other communities preserve their heritage while building better lives for their people, then Don Carlos's vision is expanding beyond even his original dreams. Through the window, they could see the restored heritage site plaque that had been installed at the mansion's entrancia bronze marker, bearing Mateo's name as guardian of the foundation, but also acknowledging the community partners who made the work possible. As the morning meeting concluded and everyone prepared for their day's work, Lucia appeared in the doorway with an expression that mixed satisfaction with gentle sadness. "It's time for me to tell you something important," she said quietly. "My work here is nearly complete." Miguel immediately understood. "You're going to leave us?" "Not leave, exactly. But my great-grandfather's immediate vision has been fulfilled. The foundation is established, successful, and sustainable. The community is engaged and empowered. You no longer need a guardian spirit to guide you. You've become the guardians yourselves." Mateo felt a deep gratitude mixed with the sadness of approaching separation. "We couldn't have done any of this without you." "You could have, and you will continue to do it. That was always the point, to find people who could carry the work forward independently." That evening, as the family gathered for dinner in their beautiful home, Mateo reflected on the journey that had brought them from counting coins for medicine to stewarding a legacy that would benefit generations. Carmen's photograph still rested in his shirt pocket, but now it felt less like a weight of loss and more like a blessing of continued love. The little girl who had said, "Please, sir, follow me," had led them not just to treasure, but to a treasure far greater than gold, the opportunity to serve something larger than themselves while building the kind of community where every family could thrive. In the garden outside, fireflies danced among the flowers, and somewhere in their gentle light, the spirit of Don Carlos smiled with satisfaction at work well begun and love well shared.